finance investments that give you more income tomorrow. And yet, what do a lot of tax systems do? They impose extra layers of tax on the people who are making that sacrifice, who are foregoing consumption today to make all of us better off in the future because they're saving and investing. And we treat those people almost like criminals in the tax code because that's where you get all the extra layers of taxation. Well, you're not going to be able to read off this chart, but this shows some of the problems we have with the U.S. tax system. And I imagine, I know most other countries have similar problems. If you earn money, you pay tax on that money, you then have some after-tax income. What do you do with that after-tax income? Well, you can consume it today, which generally means that there's not much of a tax liability. In Europe, you have a VAT liability, but not in the U.S. Or you can consume it in the future. And of course, when you consume it in the future, if you have a VAT, you pay the liability then. The problem is that government tilts the playing field between current consumption and future consumption by leveling all these additional layers of tax on income that's saved and invested. Capital gains tax, corporate income tax, dividend tax, and death tax. Now, I remember when I was working at the Heritage Foundation, and I was speaking to an audience of donors. And one of the people, after I gave a speech like this, came up to me. He's probably a guy in his mid-50s. You could tell he was very prosperous. And this was right after Bill Clinton had gotten elected and pushed through a tax increase. And this guy said to me after my speech, you know, because of Hillary, I retired. I said, Hillary? Well, you know, it's Bill, but, you know, he was obviously blaming her for some reason. Maybe he was looking into the future, I don't know. And I said, well, what do you mean? Why did you retire? And he said, well, he pushed up the income tax rate, and we have this 55% death tax, and then we double tax dividends at 40%, and we have a capital gains tax. I figured out, this is what he's telling me, I figured out that every additional dollar I was making, those crooks in Washington were going to get 85%. Now, I don't know whether his math was right, but it wasn't unreasonable. When you figure out, you know, 40% when you first earn the money, 40% tax on any dividend income coming to you, 55% death tax, not to mention whatever corporate tax is embedded in everything you do. I mean, his numbers certainly weren't very far off. Maybe he exaggerated a little bit, but imagine that. This guy said that he closed down his factory, sold off his business assets, and retired to live in a mansion in Florida. Now, I'm all in favor of him having a nice life. He worked hard, and if he wants to retire, that's his freedom. So I'm not asking you to feel sorry for him, but imagine all the people he was employing. Now, presumably, when he sold off some of his business assets, you know, some of those operations must have been maintained by new owners, but presumably a lot of people who had jobs lost jobs because this guy decided it wasn't worth working anymore because he was being taxed, not only taxed once, but taxed over and over again with a tax system that was penalizing saving and investment. And again, as I said before, every economic theory, even socialism and Marxism, they all agree that capital formation is the key to long-run growth. So why on earth, in your tax code, would you want to deliberately punish the very activities that make everyone more prosperous in the future? Now, neutrality. This is an underappreciated part of tax reform. A lot of tax systems have all sorts of special loopholes. Special interests will go to the Congress or the Parliament and say, give us a special exemption for this, or a special tax credit for this, or a deduction for this, or a loophole for this. And what happens is you have a very complicated tax code at the end of the day with a lot of decision-making in your economy based on what are the tax consequences instead of what's good for economic growth. Now think about that. If you put enough special provisions in your tax code, you could get investors to build factories that make candy bars that taste like onions. Now, I don't know many kids who are going to go out and buy candy bars that taste like onions. So presumably that would be a malinvestment. That would be a bad investment. Your economy would be losing out. But if your tax code puts in enough credits and deductions and exemptions and loopholes and preferences, you can distort economic behavior immensely. And we certainly have a lot of these problems in the U.S. We have, you know, people, We have farmers plowing up their fields to plant corn because they want to get the ethanol tax credit. And this is creating all sorts of problems with higher prices for everything from beef to sugar to you name it. The negative ripple effects of this one bad provision in the tax code are enormous. That's nonsense. Why would you want to distort your economy, and why would you want to lure people into making bad decisions on the basis of tax loopholes? And so the idea of a flat tax is tax at one rate, tax only one time, and tax equally. No more special provisions for the politically well-connected. In the U.S., if you go to our Supreme Court, etched above the columns on the Supreme Court, it says equal justice under law. What the flat tax does, it applies that principle to the tax code. No longer is there any discrimination, as I said before, on the basis of the use of income, the source of income, or the level of income. People are actually treated alike. Territoriality, another key provision, another key principle of the flat tax, not worth spending a lot of time on. I don't think it's very controversial. Now, what are the benefits of tax reform? Liberty, simplicity, prosperity, competitiveness, opportunity, equality, privacy, and enforcement. Let's walk through these things pretty quickly. Liberty is obviously, how do we define that? Is it just being left alone? Is it controlling your own life? Is it owning the fruits of your own labor? There are lots of different definitions. I'm not going to pretend that we're going to pick the exact right one. But certainly, the flat tax as a revenue-generating system is better for liberty, however you define it, than a so-called progressive tax system. Not only because you're presumably being taxed at a lower rate, although again, Iceland's a bit of an exception there, but also the government's not trying to control your life through the tax code. And there's no attempt to reward or penalize you on the basis of what politicians think you should be doing as opposed to what you think you should be doing. Now, simplicity. I don't know how long your tax forms are here in Poland, but in the United States, if you go to the IRS website, you can literally download more than 1,000 different forms. And even our simple tax return, just a basic 1040, the instruction manual is about 60 pages long. And you have well above 50% of the people in the United States, and only 30% of people itemize in the United States, but over 50% of the people have to go to a professional tax preparer to fill out their taxes. This is insane. Why do we need to have this kind of complicated system? But if you follow all the principles of a flat tax, and this is important because if you remember that list of 24 countries I put up, very few of them come even close to the pure flat tax that was created by Professors Hall and Rabushka at Stanford University's Hoover Institution. A lot of countries just take their existing tax code and slap one rate on it. Well, that's an improvement, but you're not getting rid of all the junk in the tax system, and you might not be getting rid of all the double taxation in the tax system. There are a few countries like Estonia and Hong Kong, Slovakia, that I think have done a very good job. They don't quite have this pure system, but they're very, very close. Then there are other countries that have a flat rate system, but that's really the only reform they've done. So it's progress, but not as much progress as they could be making. Now, we have a flat tax proposal in the U.S. The politicians don't want to let it go through, but this is what those 1,000 plus forms would all be thrown in the garbage, and this is what we'd have. A 10-line tax return. So simple, even your, some of you might have brothers and sisters who are still in 5th grade or something like that. They could do it as a homework assignment. In 10 minutes, they could fill out your family's tax return. But it is important to realize simplicity is not everything. This is sort of the joke of the Hillary Clinton flat tax. What did you make last year? Send it in. It's only 2 lines. I'm not sure we'd want that tax system, though, over what former House Majority Leader Dick Armey was talking about.